Before we go back to the Shamatha practice, there was a few things left over from the last session. And we were looking at anger, what it is, and in particular, why do we really get angry with people, and including ourselves. And we looked at this idea of cognitive fusion here. And so now the last topic is how to deal with anger. And remember here, anger in Buddhism is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger believes that object is a source of our suffering. So here this word anger in Buddhism includes this intention to harm. So how do we deal with anger? So of course, like attachment, the first point is to have a clear understanding of what we mean by the word anger. Otherwise there'll be this confusion about, well, sometimes actually anger is useful and not. And so again here, when we use the word anger, the way it's used in Buddhism is there's always this intention to harm. And then by getting that clear understanding of anger and understanding that anger is never useful and it's really just creating a lot of suffering for ourselves and others, then we'll by seeing the disadvantages of anger, then we will want to eliminate it. So we'll have the aspiration to eliminate it. But also, just like with attachment, here with anger, that if we really want to start to deal with anger, we really need to start to work on our view of genuine happiness. Because again, as long as we feel like the source of our happiness and suffering is out there, then I think as soon as something unpleasant comes our way, we're going to do this instantly. Because it seems like that's the source of my suffering. And so aversion will be automatic. And of course with aversion then comes anger as well. So if we can really understand that the source of happiness and suffering lies within, I think that's a good starting point to really start to work with anger. And then of course the long-term strategy, of course, as with attachment, as with all mental afflictions, is the vipassana practice of emptiness. Because all mental afflictions are based on the distorted view of reality. So if we want to eliminate any mental afflictions fully, the long-term strategy is to cultivate that wisdom of emptiness, to cut the ignorance, and then we can eliminate the mental afflictions fully. But of course, together with that long-term strategy, it would be helpful to have a short-term strategy. So what is an effective short-term strategy in dealing with anger? Again, like attachment, the first step is to cultivate more mindfulness. Because again, to be able to deal with anger, we have to be able to catch it as soon as it starts to arise. Because if we don't, then before we know it, anger has taken control of our mind, we're out of control. And then at that point, about the only thing we can really do is get out of there fast before we say and do things that we're going to regret. But of course the key is to catch it before it takes control of our mind. And that may only be a second or two. We have this little window of opportunity. If we want to be able to utilize this window of opportunity, we need more mindfulness. So the shamatha practice in general is going to help us to do that. And in particular, the shamatha practice that we're going to do tomorrow, the practice of observing the mind. More specifically, that will be very helpful. Because in that practice, we're going to start to develop the ability to watch these not only thoughts and so forth, but also these mental afflictions as they arise and pass. So if we can catch the anger before it takes control of our mind, one effective thing we can do, of course, is just watch it. Because if we are watching the anger, we're free of it. We're not caught up in it. And if we're watching it, then we're not focusing on the thing that's provoking the anger, so there's nothing feeding it, so it can't go anywhere. It'll just go and it'll pass. So that is very effective. And on top of that, of course, as with attachment, we can then what's called apply antidotes. And so again, we can apply antidotes from both wings of practice of compassion and wisdom. And as we saw in the last session, if we want to apply the antidote of compassion to anger, I think it's imperative we stop doing the cognitive fusion. Because as long as we see there's a bad person, then anger will come. Whereas if we notice anger arising, then if we can simply adopt the correct perspective and see there is a person doing a harmful behaviour, if we can make that distinguishment, then I think we can instead of the anger, we can start to have compassion and see that that person is just creating a lot of suffering for themselves and for the people around them. And of course, at the same time, not tolerate that negative behaviour and help them address that behaviour. So again, here it really comes to perspective. And of course, in the wisdom wing of practice, as before, one helpful thing is, of course, the idea of impermanence. If we can really see that things are changing moment by moment, then as with attachment where there is nothing then to grab, here with anger there is nothing to push against because everything's constantly changing. But again, at a deeper level, we can start to use this wisdom of emptiness that we're going to look at in day 9. And in this wisdom of emptiness, what we can do here is, as applying the antidote when anger is arising, is we can investigate one of 3 things. We can investigate the object of our anger, we can investigate anger itself, or we can investigate me, the person who is having the anger. And we can investigate any one of those 3 things, and if we look for the object of our anger, we look for the anger, and we look for the me that seems to be here, what we will discover is that none of these things are findable. And so that will release the grasping, and that's the basis of the anger. So then the anger will dissolve. So, of course, to be able to do this investigation, we need to have some understanding of emptiness. Otherwise, of course, we can't do that investigation. And we're going to be looking at that on day 9, what that emptiness means, so that then we can start to effectively do this sort of investigation. And that can really help us, not only with anger, but with any mental affliction that is arising in our daily life. Question?
So you said that anger has to be with a motivation to harm someone.
Correct.
And
that's how the word is used in Buddhism.
And I know about myself that whenever I'm angry, doesn't matter, it's family, friends, even people that I don't really like, I never have the intention to harm them. But I do have anger.
Right, but then what do you mean by anger?
That I'm angry, I'm pissed at them.
Right, but aren't you wanting somehow, not intellectually but instinctively, aren't you wanting them to stop that? Right, well then it's not anger. If you are pissed at them, but you are trying to help them to overcome that, that's compassion.
Yeah, that's true, but there is something in between, I think. You know?
Right.
There's something that I'm experiencing in between, which is not yet, wanting
Right.
to help them.
Sure.
But it's also, I don't want to harm them
Right.
in any way.
So what it is, I think, there can be a couple of things here. One is, instinctively, there is this aversion. Intellectually, we're thinking, no, I don't want to harm them. So there's a struggle between those two. And we know from our own experience that often if we have very strong anger, we'll actually say and do things to even the closest people closest to us, don't we? And as soon as we do that, we go, oh, I'm sorry. So there's the struggle. The struggle is that we have a strong habit, reactionary habit, instinctive, and at the same time our cognitive intellectual mind is trying to override that. And of course, if that reaction is not so strong, sometimes our intellectual mind can subdue that, can notice there's this habit of lashing out, but then our intellectual mind goes, hang on, no. So there's always this struggle. And that's the problem here, is that as long as we leave it as an intellectual idea not to harm, it's always going to be a struggle. And there'll be always situations where it's a strong stimulus that you're going to react and you're going to regret it. So what we're trying to do here is to bring that intellectual understanding into experience through practice. Then what you're going to find is that rather than having this instinctive reaction and trying to override it with intellectual and compassion, it will be more instinctively just compassion. So that's what we're trying to do. So you're right, there is like this transition. Whereas, of course, often people who really don't have any compassion, there is no intellect overriding. They just react and they think that that's fine.
Right.
Yeah?
Does it also include verbally when, yes?
Of course.
When you say something bad verbally also equals...
These are our habits. We have verbal and physical habits. I mean, really, if we are really in a sort of if we have a short temper, someone says something to us, even our closest friend, we often we lash out and then we go, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. So again, there's a struggle between our instinct and our intellect. And if we just leave it there, the intellect, it'll always be a struggle, always be a struggle. So all of these practices, vipassana, compassion and so forth, are trying to change our habits. And to change those habits, we need to bring the intellect to experience. And the only way we're going to do that is if we have the basis of shamatha. Because if we try and do compassion, vipassana, with a distracted mind, it's going to stay at the intellectual level. And it's not going to be very strong. So the antidote will be very weak and it'll be a struggle. It'll be constantly a struggle to apply antidotes. But if we can bring these practices into experience based on the shamatha, then they can really start to apply at a very experiential level. So it'll take time for that to happen, of course.
But it's even speech inside.
Sorry?
I'm saying that verbally it's inside, even if I'm very
if I
restrain myself.
Yeah.
Restrain, yeah.
And I can hear my aversion inside, it's still an aversion.
Of course, but if you see your aversion, it means you're not caught up in it.
Yes, but I see myself talking bad things.
Right, and so that's better than getting caught up in talking bad. So already that's one step better.
But it's still aversion.
Of course, but at least you're not fully caught up in aversion because you're managing to step back a little bit and notice that. It's sort of like a little bit caught up, but a little bit watching it.
And then I'm disgusting myself.
Well, but then that's cognitive fusion. So then you're beating yourself up.
To myself,
That's right. So when you notice that, instead of beating yourself up and feeling bad, that's cognitive fusion. That's no use. then just acknowledge, okay, I have this strong habit of saying these. I'm going to work on reducing that. So you can still feel good about yourself and work on reducing that habit of saying bad things. Beating yourself up is based on cognitive fusion. It's no use. It just makes you feel bad. It's not going to help anything.
It's like disappointing. Like I can hear my words and I don't like it.
Right. Good. Good that you don't like it, because then it gives you the drive to do something about it. But again, with all of these things, and I think that's why in a lot of modern therapies it's a big struggle, is because it's difficult to change habits. And at an intellectual level, it's a lot of work to try and change habits, and often it's not very successful because our habits are very inground. So we need some strong antidote to habits. And the strong antidote is we need to create new habits. And to create new habits, we need to bring that intellectual ideas into experience. And that's why we need to have it based on the Shamatha practice. Because to make compassion and loving kindness and wisdom a habit, to bring from intellectual to experiential, we need the Shamatha to really penetrate, to start to build new habits. Otherwise, it's just going to be intellectual, and there's always going to be this struggle, and we're never really going to change, transform in a very big way. It'll always be hard work.
I understand the cognitive fusion piece is very helpful, but a lot of, for me, some of my anger comes from a sense of fairness. It's at situations more than at people.
And what, sorry?
It's at situations, but it's directed at situations rather than people.
Sure.
Is there like a Buddhist approach to fairness, or just like what's the, because that's a source of anger for me, and if I want to try to stem that,
right?
What's a good approach to
Can you give me a concrete example?
Illness of a family member. I get very angry at life, generally speaking.
In Buddhism, sometimes on this point, there's a discussion about, do we get angry at fire when it burns us? No, because its nature is to burn. So why get angry at something that it's nature? And it's a nature of our body to have illness and sickness. That's its nature. So to get angry at that is not helpful, and it's opposite to reality. So therefore, I think again, if we avoid the cognitive fusion, then and understand things, see things clearly, then instead of getting angry and frustrated, we can really see those suffering situations, and that can motivate us for compassion and to do whatever we can to improve that situation. I think that's going to be helpful.
It seems to me when I look at people, like you said, that there are people that have these habits and they manifest it, like they do the negative, but they don't have the intellectual. So then they don't experience regret, and then it seems that it is a nice way of living because it's easier in some way. They don't need to change anything.
Right. It's the saying, better the devil you know than the one you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's why we get stuck a lot, because even though, maybe we're not having such a great life, but we got used to our life. We got used to our craving, attachment, jealousy, anger. Okay, it's not great and we suffer, but okay. We just are complacent, because often we feel like, and I think modern society often gives us this message, is actually you can't change much. There's a lot of modern philosophies that say, well, the basic human nature is greed, it's anger, it's jealousy. You better get used to it. At best you can maybe reduce it a bit, but that's tough luck. You're stuck. And that's the message we hear, and we go, okay, nothing I can do, I'm stuck. But of course Buddhism would disagree with this. It's not the basic human nature, anger, greed, jealousy and so forth. Of course we have a strong tendency, a habit for anger, greed and so forth. But actually sometimes they ask the Dalai Lama, what he thinks, or according to Buddhism, is the basic human nature. And he says caring is the basic human nature.
Yeah, but there are people that don't suffer.
Well, they do.
They just don't know it.
Correct. And often, because, exactly. They don't know it. Because they're not cognitively aware of anything else. They think that that's normal, that's okay. Right? And unfortunately, that's the message we get from a lot of modern theories, that that's it, you're stuck. And of course, we look around and everyone else seems to be in a similar, many people seems to be in a similar state. So we think, okay, well, that's it. I better make most of this because this is it. But of course, Buddhism would disagree with this.
If I'm nervous at my child, of course I don't want to hurt him. I call it anger. How do you call it?
If you want to, sorry?
If I'm nervous at my child, I call it anger. You don't call it anger because I don't want to hurt him. How do you call it?
Well, it depends on motivation. So we can use very strong language and behaviour with a motivation of wishing to help. So then it's compassion. But that doesn't necessarily mean what we're doing is the right thing, because with compassion has to come wisdom. I mean, we can have a very good motivation and create a lot of suffering. You know? So if compassion has no wisdom, it's blind. But at least the first point is to have the motivation of wishing to help rather than harm. That's the first step. But then together with that wish to help, we need to bring in wisdom to see, well, what can I do? How can I help? And then we act. Now, of course, there's no book you can go to that says do this, because every situation is unique. So we have to evaluate every situation on its own merits, and then using the motivation of compassion and as much wisdom as we have, we decide on how to respond. And sometimes wisdom might tell us, actually in this situation it's better to back out. For example, if someone's in a rage, not much point saying anything to them. Whatever you say is just going to make it worse. So wisdom will say, in that situation, might say, okay, no use trying to say anything. I just step back, let them blow off a bit of steam, let them calm down, and then I'll try to talk to them when they're more calm, for example. So I think if we do that, I mean, that's all we can do in any situation. And of course, sometimes the way in which we respond doesn't work. We make a mistake, but then we don't beat ourselves up. We just go, okay, well, that didn't work, so next time I know to do something a bit different. And then we just improve our wisdom. I mean, that's all we can do. No one can ask more of that of us. So again, if we can really have best possible motivation and bring in as much wisdom as we can, I mean, that's all we can do. If we do that, that's good. And of course, always trying to improve motivation and improve wisdom. Not be satisfied with our level of compassion and wisdom now, but constantly trying to improve that. I mean, we can't do more than that.
What about the practice of saying words like compassion and loving kindness? I heard a lot of...
To verbalise them?
Verbalize like... To wish someone verbally.
You mean
Not
to
like,
tell them or just to...
No, when I'm practicing...
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Nothing like, it's not like your, like you did the practice here that you gave us.
Sure.
Just to
Sure.
verbally...
Exactly. I mean, of course, with these practices, we're trying to transform the mind, but particularly in the beginning stages, we can use all sorts of things to help us to do that. And one thing is we may verbalise these thoughts to make them more explicit, to verbalise them. May you be happy, may you be free of suffering. We can verbalise. But what we need to be careful of, if we verbalise, that often it can just become blah, 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 and nothing's going on in the mind. Often in a lot of these practices, particularly in like Tibetan Buddhism, you have verses. You know, like the four immeasurables that says, you know, may all sentient beings have happiness as causes, may they all be free of suffering as causes. We have these verses as part of the practice. And that's good to remind us what to do. But the danger is that people get that and go, okay, may all sentient beings have happiness as causes, may all be free of suffering. Tick, done, what's next? And it's just verbalised. It's just blah, blah, blah. Nothing's going on inside. So, you know, we can use verbalisation, but only as an aid to transforming the mind, not as a replacement. Because we can mouth these verses all day long, but if nothing's going on in our mind, it's just meaningless.
Yes, this practice that we did last hour, we need to visualize something. You understand? So I like it better because it's like energy, and I can take and...
Yeah, so everyone is different. Some people are very visual, some people are very auditory, some people are very tactile. We have different modalities. So therefore, in these practices, it's good to use that modality that you really resonate with. So some people are very auditory, so for them, mentally or verbally reciting these words is very powerful. For other people, they're very visual, so they find a visual approach is very powerful in that way. Some people are more energetic, so they work on a more energetic level, so that's okay. So the practice, remember, is to cultivate compassion and loving kindness. And we can use these different modalities to support that and enhance that. So whatever sort of we resonate with, we can emphasize that way of approaching it.
Does Buddhism have any wisdom around fear or handling fear?
Fear, again, of course, some fear is based in reality, you know, some danger or so forth. But again, a lot of our fear is irrational fear. And so therefore, if we can simply apply wisdom, then a lot of these irrational fears will just dissipate. And often, and this is something we're going to touch on in day 9, often a lot of fear comes from a false perspective of me, of how we see ourselves as something separate from the world. So not only because of that we get a lot of attachment aversion, but then a lot of fear and anxiety can come. So at a very deep level, a lot of this irrational fear that we have, we can eliminate through the Vipassana practice of emptiness. But again, at a sort of short-term level or at an immediate level, this is very helpful, is to just notice fear when it arises.